to get traction, and I think that's probably a consequence of it being genuinely innovative, that people didn't quite know what to make of it, and it took a while for sort of the audience to catch up to what this experience could be. Um,
I want to talk about what probably was so new and fresh for the audience, but I cannot help but note the idea that a game could be even allowed that much time to find its audience is almost unimaginable now. Was that just because of where games were sold that you would find that in a larger computer store because the industry for games had not grown to the point where they could have their own sort of special retail outlets. It's just, I mean, I think for a lot of people that just sounds kind of astonishing.
yeah, no, the other games like the Age of Empires games were similar in that they didn't actually sell that well early on, but by year 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 10, the sales just kept on coming. But I don't think, yeah, today at least in terms of retail sales, you could not do that today. Today it's all about pre-sales and hype and making sure you have 100,000 pre-orders or a half a million pre-orders or whatever it is. If you don't have that, you don't have a AAA title, and so it's like Hollywood. It's like a film, right? I mean, you have to have a big opening weekend or you're done. That's just the business end of retail gaming, and that's why crowdsource funding and digital distribution combined creates a whole new opportunity to, as Tim was saying earlier, it's going to take us the better part of 2 years to complete development of this Underworld Ascendant. We can have a dialogue and have the fans all participate in that whole process, and we can, so they'll learn to understand what we're building. They can see prototypes, they can see alpha versions. It's not this thing where there's an opening weekend and that's the only window to get people on board with what it is. So it puts us back in some ways even better than uh, the early days where you would have a couple years to get traction on shelf space. Here you can get people understanding and really buying into the vision before the game's even done, which is pretty cool.
It's kind of fun to root for creative people. That's another aspect I've kind of found out of sort of this new Kickstarter and independent model. It's like you're aware of it, you love the idea, let's really, I don't know, kind of hold hands and really hope this all comes to fruition. So going back to sort of people like not knowing exactly what to make of Ultima Underworld when it first came out. What aspect of the game was it the 3D or was it the play as you will? What in your opinion, do you think was the hardest kind of psychological or design comprehension for the average player to have to get over to really understand what was in that game?
Interesting question. I don't know. Every player is different, so I think some players the 3D really threw them, particularly if they were fantasy role players, because the fantasy role playing games before then were all 2D kind of overhead. Some were sort of faked isometric, but it was a tactical view, and it was typically often turn based, slow pace, very different kind of gameplay. So if that's how you thought of a role playing game, and suddenly you were in this fluid 3D first person environment where you come around a dark corner and a monster's slathering there. That's kind of a shock. uh, so I think for some players that aspect was a learning curve, a new experience. But the other thing had nothing to do with the visuals or the 3D. It was this open world sandbox play, which really wasn't being done then. That whole sense of, okay, I'm in this vast underworld, and I could go in 5 different directions and head down. I could go left and then go down that direction and explore a subterranean stream, or I could clamber down the shaft and enter into this, giant chasm, or I could go to the dwarven mines, and the game's not telling me which way to go. It's all kind of open. I think that aspect was another dimension that could be challenging for a lot of players.
I mean, I think definitely. I mean, I even know as someone I know this. You guys played arcade games as well. That I come from this original tradition of almost an absurd level of memorization of enemy behavior and sort of how and playing to the music inside of the game. that it's almost like just sort of a Simon Says type of way that back in the '80s, and just the idea of like relatively early in the '90s, really talking about 10, 12, 15 years. It's like, hey, here's the world, have fun, we're out of here. It definitely is. I mean, it's kind of phenomenal when you consider how quickly things could advance to something like that, but also very easy to understand that it was a hard thing to try to articulate to the player and have to get their heads around it.
Well, one thing that helped is that for a fantasy game like the Underworlds, a lot of us did a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and pen and paper role playing, and in those games, when I first started playing those games, which would have been about 1975, when they were still in mimeographed, copies of what was before, you could buy a D&D book. These were like, Men in Magic and stuff like that. These prequels, but it was still, the concept was there of, which was totally novel for its time, that you had a dungeon master creating a world, and then the players would interpret it and come up with their own way to play. And that sensibility was really what fed into a lot of the things that we were doing with Underworld. That let's create a world that you as a player could sort of craft your own experience in, which is very much a pen and paper kind of mentality.
Moving on to, I'm curious. Paul, I can't remember how much you were ever attached to the original Thief game, but and so forgive me if I'm asking this question inappropriately. First person by that point was not a mystery. We had already had Doom and Quake. It wasn't something sort of technically that people had to get their minds wrapped around while playing it. But I think stealth from that perspective was an entirely different story, and a game that was wholly dependent upon that. And I think just by virtue of the fact that Garrett had a sword, it became almost confusing to me. I mean, I kind of wanted to default to that and just kill everybody, because that's what most first-person games had conditioned me to do. But sort of, how did you see the reaction for that game when it came out? Because it was another example of you guys going for something very new and different and innovative.
Yeah, we wanted to break the rules and the expectations in the first-person space with that. I was a creative director on that project and sort of came up with the original concept, but it was a quick side story. We're obviously playing System Shock here, but a quick side story on Thief is that the game started as the Dark Project, based around a Arthurian legend, flipping it around so the good guys were the bad guys, or vice versa. And we wanted to achieve. Doug Church had a big role on that project, and he and some others really wanted to do a delightful, especially delightful, sword fighting game that had really cool first person sword fighting. And after maybe a half a year of trying to make that work, we couldn't figure out how to make it fun. and so we sort of hit a hard spot of saying, our whole core premise for this game is going nowhere. And that's when we pivoted and said, let's do stealth instead. And we do have sword fighting in Thief. It's not the most interesting part. You're not even very good at it. The stealth became the way that we took that forward. But it was a new experience, because people played first-person shooters back then. You gunned everything that moved, and you were a walking, giant machine gun in a lot of those games, and the body count was in the thousands or tens of thousands. And if that's what you're used to, Thief is a very different experience.
It really was a patience trainer, is what I used to kind of call it back then.
But it was our most successful franchise of all the franchises we did at Looking Glass. So commercially, it worked out. It wasn't just sort of an interesting experiment that only appealed to a very, very narrow slice of players. It did quite well.
And then moving on, obviously, to the game that we're looking at right now, which is System Shock 2. I probably have the clearest memory. I was probably 2, maybe 3 years into my career sort of covering the games industry. And that I think that there was weeks or months on end where this was the only game that we were talking about. And that, it's interesting from sort of, as we're talking about the various reactions, that what System Shock 2 was asking the player to do, which still right now seems so sort of innovative, even for its time. I remember everyone sort of, at least among the gaming press, really kind of knew what it was doing and just could not get enough of
We did our job then.
it. Yes, I mean, do you think it's kind of the apotheosis of what the Looking Glass philosophy was, or was it is there or is there any one game you think that that's most representative of what you were always striving to do?
Looking Glass evolved as a studio. We grew. We brought new people aboard. Like Ken Levine came about halfway through Looking Glass. Uh, every team was different, had its own dynamic and its own personality. We didn't try to do the same thing with every game. So I wouldn't look at any one game as saying this represents Looking Glass. It was really an arc. It was a process of discovery for us, trying out different kinds of gameplay. You see some very strong threads through them. I think the DNA is very recognizable, and I think anyone who starts looking at, and I encourage folks to come to our Kickstarter site for No Ascended, but you'll see the same DNA there. It's been taken forward a lot of years, but it's that discovery and and sort of the tenets of the player is authoring the experience ahead of us as designers. We like to think we're pretty good designers, but the player ultimately is the best designer, and we're there to empower the player.
Now, obviously, in the wake of all of these games, we have started to see other games. I mean, it wasn't that long before we actually saw Deus Ex coming out. That was probably the next step in this evolution. Do you sort of look at games that are about player authorship or deep player choice or big open worlds and kind of chuckle to yourself and say, "Ha, I helped make that happen"? I mean, do you get a sense that your DNA has been passed on into so many other games that have come out in the ensuing years?
It is fun to see games that you say, oh, they clearly got this from System Shock 2 or from Thief, or to talk to designers, whether it's Ken who literally worked with us and then has sort of taken forward the narrative direction in a whole new dimension with the Bioshock games, or games like Dishonored out of the Arcane guys. The Arcane guys we've done some work with over the years. I think Dishonored does some pretty wonderful stuff in exploring some new gameplay directions. Um, but in the scheme of things, there's precious few of these kinds of games being done. It's still pretty thin. We think there's space to do more.
I think there definitely is as well, and I think there's a lot of. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. In the years that I would, be covering the games industry, and I would have a lot of interaction with our viewers. This type of game was the one that was definitely held up as what was most desirable. That that it really did seem to speak to an innate desire among players to. Yeah, I think explore what games could offer that no other entertainment medium could, and that sense of, as you were pointing it out, that the player really becomes the ultimate designer of the experience because you're really just kind of giving them the tools and letting them go. But I mean, yeah, have you ever thought like why this seems to resonate so deeply with so many core players out there?
Because I think if you're playing games as opposed to if you're going to spend a weekend or an evening playing a game as opposed to watching a really good film or reading a really good novel, it's because you want this kind of experience. You want something that you're driving the experience. You're doing more than just pushing a few buttons and watching cinematics play in front of you. It's what is distinctive and unique about this media, more so than the other mediums. And so, for the core players, even more so, they want to feel clever. They want to kind of discover the world and become masters of these little universes, and we're allowing them to do that.
No, I like the idea of becoming the masters of the universe because that really, I think that really kind of hits on. Because A, you have to build the universe to be able to have any desire to have mastery over it, and then you have to also allow the player to really kind of assume that position as they play it more and more of understanding and having
And
this
speaking of the
program.
masters, maybe we should let some of our the fans listening in ask some questions at this stage.
Oh yes, yes, yes. Let's take a look, guys. I know obviously you're watching this stream, So let's start throwing some questions here, and let's see if we can get Paul. And Paul, are you still there with Tim?
Yeah,